for a mic because I'm rather soft-spoken. But if the mic becomes distracting, just tell me and I'll project my voice. It really hasn't changed in 32 years, and I don't think it's going to change today either. First, Dave, thanks so much for that introduction. I first got linked up with Dave Maxwell when I got a call in Iraq from the Chief of Staff of the Army, and he said, hey, Ed, we want you to command 2nd Infantry Division. And I was like, but I've never been to Korea. He goes, oh, you'll be fine. Just go over there, you'll be great. And so literally that's the preparation I had. I've never served in Asia, so crash course in studies, and Len and I, one of our best assignments. However, the same thing happened here. I'm in up in Dondashan, up by the demilitarized zone, and my Chief of Staff of the Army says, oh, hey Ed, for your next assignment, we want you to command on the cyber. And I said, I'm not a cyber person. And he said, well, you'd be great. Okay, and so, again, another crash course. But I think what I bring to this space is operations. But let me back up a little bit and start off with today's President Lincoln's birthday. And when you think about that, he's known as the first wired president. Telegraph was invented in 1940. 1960, when the war was becoming imminent, there was only one telegraph in this entire city. And it was in the War Department, which is now the old Executive Office building. And for the first year of the war, he didn't really use the telegraph that much. But then he started to figure out how it could be used. And so first he started with information, and I have to back up a little bit. Secretary Stanton, he did understand the power of the telegraph. And he asked the president if he could, basically, I would describe it as gain full control over the telegraph and the information on it. And so you started to see locking up journalists, all kinds of problems with security, civil liberties, etc., which caused a debate. There's a number of Supreme Court cases that happened during that time, and I'll come back to that here in a minute. But then President Lincoln started to understand, hey, I can use this telegraph to talk to my commanders. And some of you know he had troubles with those first several commanders until Grant came on board, and he had to give them very specific directions. So that's a series of telegrams. And then there's another series when Grant came on board, how they worked together in a partnership. So really 3 phases. What's interesting, because President Lincoln did not keep a diary, we have his letters, and we have just under 1,000 telegrams that he sent as the President of the United States during the Civil War. And so when you think about that, he is the first president. Now let me give you a couple frames, and I want to set this up in the beginning. So before the telegraph, you had messengers and mail. And then the telegraph becomes into play. After that, voice, right? Telephones. After that, computers, email, chat. After that, mobile devices, text, social media. And who knows what the future will hold in the future. So if you start with that frame, how's the protection? Well, you could look at messengers and messages, encryption, deception, codes, cryptology, all that was already invented. The question is, how do you put that on the telegraph? During the Civil War, encryption was already being used. But now as you go to the telephone, you have the same thing. We had devices to make secure telephone calls, etc. But somewhere between the 1988, 1991, 1988 being a defining moment because that's the first time a large worm, the Morris worm, was launched on computers. 1991 is largely recognized as the start of the Internet, World Wide Web. When you take those somewhere in that time frame, all of a sudden encryption and security started to become a lot more difficult because there's more connections, more global, and at the same time, I call the dark side of the Internet started to emerge. Started with hacktivists, criminals, terrorism, and then nation states. And it worked on a line that goes exploitation, first people just looking at things, then disruption, how we can do things, to the latest, which is destruction, which, you know, the 2 big ones that people will talk about now is the Iranians against Saudi Aramco, and now Sony by the North Koreans. So if you take that, now let's talk about the policies that regulate that. And so for the telephone, all the way up to 1988, pretty good body of knowledge all the way back to the invention of the telephone on how to control telecommunications. And you can see all that. But when the web started, it started to become difficult. And why is that? We were using 19th century law and policy and 20th century law and policy for now a 21st century world. But when you look at the way the telephone works and you look at the way the computers and our interconnectedness works, that doesn't exactly match up. And that is one of the great challenges here of today. So the way I define it is the world is really changing. And the problem is our government processes aren't really keeping up in pace. When you say cyber, most people, it conjures up a negative image. But I always have to start off with, it has brought incredible advances. When I look at, when I was a teenager, okay, the only computer was in the school had 8 punch cards. 8 cards could take 8 punch cards, that was it. And I look at what people have today and how it's impacted every part of our society for good, it's incredible. As it's impacted our society, what it's also done for our military has been incredible. We have capabilities that we could have only dreamed of or didn't even dream of when I started off as a young lieutenant 32 years ago. But there's also a downside, and behind me I always put up this map. I'm not advertising for FireEye, okay, just put that up front. But I like this because what you see there, those are attacks right now. This isn't something that's going to happen in the future. This is contested space right now. And from where I sit, and I've been in this job for 17 months, here's the big trends. The threats are increasing. Increasing in scope, increasing in breadth. What do I mean by that? When I first started, we might get one serious event at a time. Now I get multiple. At the same time, vulnerabilities are increasing. In the last 6 months, there's been 2, often called bash or shell shock. One of those, Unix code that's been around for a long time, anything that had Unix code as its base, 20 years of code, made vulnerable. Just because someone found a hole in the code, and so anything that's using that now became vulnerable to an attacker. The complexity is increasing. We're hooking up everything to the internet, everything. And so when you do that, if you're a math major, every time you add 1, the number of connections just double. And so the complexity is becoming unreal. And now the most scary part of this whole thing is the barriers to entry are dropping. And what do I mean by that? If you wanted to be a hardcore hacker 20 years ago, you had to be a hardware engineer or a software engineer. Today, you just have to be good at downloading stuff off the internet and adapting to what you're seeing. You can go on the internet right now, buy scanning tools, buy attack tools. You can even get them where they guarantee them. Where they'll guarantee them to work, money back guarantees. It's incredible. So let me now start a little bit with policy. So President Obama started off his 5 large principles that he put out in 2013. The first one is a whole of government approach. The second one is network defensive first. The third one is protection of privacy and civil liberties. The fourth one is private-public cooperation. And the last one is international cooperation and engagement. So I think those are all quite admirable. The problem is our implementation of this is very, very uneven. So let me talk a little bit first about the progress. So after several months, years of deliberation, we have finally sorted out the lanes between the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of Homeland Security. And it basically works like this. The Department of Defense is responsible for what's called the .mil domain, the military domain. The Department of Homeland Security is responsible for the .gov domain. And private industry is responsible for the rest. The .com, .org, all of that is private. And the sharing relationships, just in the 17 months I've been in command, have really, really improved. I think it's improving because of what's behind me. Because we all realize now we're in together. When we say .mil domain in military networks, well, you know, most of the military networks actually ride over commercial networks. It's not like we have our own communication system. We actually use the commercial systems around the world. The second challenge, though, is, so what is the relationship between the government to private? And that has been challenged and still remains challenged. That may change due to this week's announcement of a cyber international threat center. I think this has real potential, and I'll talk more about the challenges of private here in a moment. And then President Obama's going to make a big speech at Stanford tomorrow where I think we're going to get a lot of this laid out here in more detail. I say this challenge with the private because former Representative Rogers, and I've talked to him a few times, tried to get cybersecurity legislation passed to address this partnership since 2006 and was unable to do so. And that's because there are so many competing ideas. So let me start with the questions that we have. And words here are important. What I mean by this is, you'll hear the term cyberattack. I don't think that's really the right way to describe it. The right way to describe it is attacks in cyberspace. And I say cyberspace because if you back up, all of the devices in the world are on what we would call a geographic layer. You can put them in a place somewhere on the earth. But the problem is those digits, once you hit send on a computer or on your phone or on a radio that is riding over the internet, you don't really know where those packets went. You really don't. They could have gone around the world. It's all based on the routing tables of how the internet works. And so there's a real challenge here when you say attack in cyberspace. What does that really mean? And for a policy view, when you say attack, there's a lot of treaties in place that say we'll come in defense of an attack. So you can instantly start to see how complex this could become rapidly. Huge debate in the papers just over Sony, should we call it an attack or not? And you saw that play out here just over the last few weeks. The second one, who owns the problem? When it's all mixed up between government and private on a global scale, who owns that? And then how do we deal with the sovereignty issues? What I say by sovereignty issues, some of these attacks you're seeing right here, this is how it works. Nobody ever, I'll use China. China was, I'll use that, it's very appropriate for FireEye because there's a report called the Mandate Report, where they basically outline how the Chinese have been responsible for the largest theft of intellectual property in U.S. history. But China doesn't go from China to X company. That's not how they do it. They go through other countries. And so the challenge is, what are the sovereignty implications as you go through all this? Then the next piece of this is liability. This is the problem in the commercial space. So imagine, you've signed up with X company, your stuff gets attacked. We would normally do what? You're going to sue them. And so the companies don't want to share the information if they've been attacked. Because if they do, they open themselves up to liability. And this has been this is why you don't see this sharing. The problem is you're all in it together. So companies over here have been attacked. Companies over here don't know. And so you have this really interesting conglomeration of, if we could get information sharing fixed, that would do a lot to help us. And then the challenges of national security and civil liberties. I remind people I'm an American citizen. I grew up in Santa Cruz County, California. That probably tells you a lot about the way I grew up here, in the 70s, no less, okay? You know, I'm an American citizen too, right? I like my privacy too. And so sometimes people see that way. And I'll talk more about that here in a little bit. And this brings me to you, right? Because I'm not going to solve these problems by myself. The president can't solve these problems by himself. The Congress can't solve them. But each one of you is going to get our policy, and we got to get it on the right path. And I believe we're on that path, but there is a lot of work to be done. And I think here's the areas I think we have to concentrate on. First, the definitions aren't well understood. If you don't have a common language, then how are you going to have a policy that means the same thing to everyone? I have 3 lawyers on my staff to help me sort this out. The debates over the language itself is incredible. The second part, what's the strategy? But think about strategy that has to move at the pace of Moore's law. Okay, so this is the other problem, is you make a strategy, but that strategy may not survive. So how's it adaptable and agile enough to account for that? And what's the organization? How do we organize ourselves in government and private partnerships? How do we really do that? And then I talked about policies. Policies, and I mean it's both law and policies. And then finally, how do we talk about it? I would argue that we need a lot of different strategies. This is not a military problem. This is a much bigger problem than the military to solve. However, the military certainly can play a role and will be part of it because, like cyberspace being a domain, we consider it a domain in the military. What do I mean by that? We have a land domain, an air domain, a sea domain, a space domain, and now cyber domain. People don't even agree that there is a cyber domain, but in the Department of Defense we consider it to be a cyber domain. So last month, the administration again put out 3 more principles to work. First one is enable information sharing. This is a result from how do we protect companies and encourage them to share the information on their attacks. That's the first part. The second part is modernizing law enforcement efforts to go after cyber criminals. This is a huge problem. You can imagine a lot of this you're dealing global. For example, one of the greatest problems we have with people overseas, I'll use ISIS for example. What happens if ISIS is using a US Twitter account? What are the implications of that? Right, so normally, before, when I was in Iraq before, it's all confined to Iraq. And in Iraq, you have authorities that are given by the president to take appropriate action. But what happens when the cyber piece is global? And there are all these different countries, but our policies don't work at the speed of the ones and zeros as they're traveling. And then the last one is the national data breach reporting. I think as Americans, we have some tremendous advantages though. One is we have information technology dominance. That dominance is fading, but we still have it, and I believe we can still keep it if we make the right decisions and investments. The second one is I believe that openness and transparency will overcome authoritarianism. And what do I mean by that? Sometimes I talk about Mr. Snowden and the 3 big impacts that have caused us problems in the national security arena. They go like this. The first one is it has definitely impacted the way that terrorists operate around the world. No question. The second one is it showed authoritarian regimes how they could use information technology to better control their people. Now, I don't think that was an intended result of what he wanted to happen, but that is what happened. And then the last one is, which is the most extreme, it may be the beginning of the destruction of the internet as we know it. And what I mean by that is countries that think they can wall themselves off from the internet and have their own enclaves, which then works against the open, transparent internet, which is stated interest of the United States. So if you think about an authoritarian regime, and sometimes you hear, for example, in China, the Great Firewall in China. Well, to maintain a Great Firewall, you got to keep that secret, which means that code is going to move a lot slower than code that's open. And so I think just by virtue of our society, the way we believe in openness and transparency, and you're starting to see, Microsoft has put their code out now for free, right? Their open, Rackspace has open code. That's so everyone can work on it for a positive good. That code is going to move a lot faster than code that is locked up in a closet trying to be kept secure in a place that's not kept secure will always find vulnerability. New policy areas. cloud technologies. So if there's a data breach in a cloud, but the cloud is distributed globally, who's responsible for that? And how's that going to work? So there's this rush to cloud for efficiencies, but there's not been a lot of discussion about what does it mean in terms of security. What about big data analytics? So there's a lot of data on all of us out there left around. If you collect enough of the data in the right places, you can actually aggregate someone's pattern of life. And so when you start, you go to companies are starting to collect all the data they can to hunt for cyber criminals, cyber attacks, etc. But when you aggregate all that data, you can also start running up against possible civil liberties. And so this is an area that needs some work. What about the Internet of Things? Did any of you see the 60 Minutes on Sunday? They demonstrate, I could probably send you the transcript if you want. It's, they actually got in a car and they demonstrated they could take full control of this car. Go ahead, step on the brakes, your brakes don't work. Step on the gas goes on. And this is, it's not that the normal people would do this, but there are people out there when you just connect stuff to the internet, your refrigerator starts to talk to you, right? All of us have different personas. And then I just lay those three out, but think about it in terms, again, I go back to Moore's Law, that's what it is today. When I was at Google several months ago, I asked them to tell me, could you define for me the computing environment 5 years from now? They said, can't be done. I said, I need you to realize I didn't come from the cyber world, right? I need you to explain that better. He says, I've been a software engineer for a long time, and computers are designing what they call a 7-layer stack. I won't bore you with that, what all that is. But he goes, normally just one layer would be under transformation at a time. Right now, all 7 layers are under transformation, and some are converging. So the key for us, big companies right now, is not to be too wrong. And that's when I started really watching what Google was buying, the companies they were buying, and I understood that strategy. They just can't afford to be wrong. Did it surprise you that Facebook bought WhatsApp, right? Because WhatsApp already had 450 million users in 18 months. They were getting ready to eat Facebook. So 19 billion was a bargain. So these are sort of the things to watch as the trends in the space. So I'd like to just close, because I really want to get to the questions. I hope this created the opportunity here for some questions. I'm a runner, and when I spent time up here at Fort Myer before I moved down to Fort Belvoir, I love running, and I would always go up on the Lincoln Memorial. And I would look at the one wall with the Gettysburg Address, look at the other wall with the second inaugural address, and I always go like, could I ever write like that? I mean, it's incredible, right? And so I'm always inspired by the phrase here, and both parties appreciated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. And I kind of did my own little paraphrase. In no way do I think it's like that, right? And I'll leave you with this thought. The struggle's upon us, and both parties see it. But one side would rather accept risk to security for privacy and civil liberties, and the other side would rather give up their privacy and civil liberties for better security. The future's here now. And so to me, as we work our way through this, there's the paradox. And I'll leave you with this last frame. When I was at the National War College, and you had difficult problems and started really thinking about national policies, one of my professors said, Ed, think about this kind of an argument. What's the first question you got to ask is, what's the real question? And I'll use a abortion example because it's so easy. When you understand the question, there's going to be a paradox, right to life, right to choose. And when you understand that, you realize your choices are going to be bad. But then at least you can describe it in a way to develop a strategy to work forward. So if you understand the question, the paradigm or direction by which it was asked, the paradox that exists. So this paradox between, I closed with national security and privacy, it's going to be at the central core of this debate for a long time. And so with that, I want to stop and I look forward to all your questions.
As always, raise your hand and state your name and ask your question.
Mr. Joel Meredith, thank you for coming out to speak. Could you explain a little bit more when you said we have IT dominance now? Could you describe exactly what you mean by that, and how soon you think that we're going to be on an even playing field?
Yeah. So I'm a believer in Porter. I don't know if you follow the work of Michael Porter, who talks about competitive advantage. And so to me, a national treasure of the United States is Silicon Valley. So it has this ability to, when I've been there, a lot of people there, they work on problems because they're interesting problems, not because they need money. And that kind of, when you want to excite them, just go out there and say, I think this is impossible. Oh my gosh. I mean, that's like game on, right? We have that right now, and I think the reason that we'll maintain it for a while is because, first, obviously there's a lot of money to be made there, but it is, it's a place where like-minded people, I mean, they're driven to advance this space in a positive way to do good for the world. I mean, if you're, I grew up only 60 miles from there, so I have a sense for where, well, actually I lived in San Jose for the first 10 years of my life. But the, so IT dominance, the question is, are we wide enough, right? Because the danger in this space is what I talked about with WhatsApp. There's something out there that moves really fast and eats the other technology. So sometimes people ask me what books to read, right? And the two books that I read the last year that have made the most impact on me in this space have been The Innovator's Dilemma and Dealing with Darwin. Both of those books, Innovator's Dilemma talks about the inability for organizations to transform rapidly, which causes them to be, they actually go bankrupt most of the time because they're unable to change their processes. This is what I worry about, right? Because we don't have an option, right? That's not an option, is to go bankrupt, right? So how do you create an organization that, here you are at the top of your game, but you recognize there's something down here. How can you harness it without the organization capturing this piece? Dealing with Darwin, I used to talk about being an innovative organization. I didn't realize there were 3 different types of innovation. Actually, there's 14 that he describes in the book, but the 3 big areas are disruptive technologies, but process innovation and operational innovation. A great example of one of those is Walmart, which basically did the whole thing. But going back to the innovation, let's just take the S&T budgets of the biggest companies, right? And this is a challenge for us because we're under a lot of budget pressure in the military. So our S&T budget for our Army is in the $3 to $4 billion range, right? Which is a lot of money. But Microsoft's S&T budget is $13 billion. Cisco is 14.5. Microsoft is between 7 and 8, and I could go on and on and on. Look at the money that's being spent in this space to continue to improve it. And so I feel like for the foreseeable future, we're going to be in a good place. But I do worry about the innovator's dilemma, that we won't see something down here, or we'll dismiss it, and it will come around. We'll have an advantage because I think by the virtue of our society, it is actually quite agile. We may think it's slow at times, but as I travel in other countries, it's quite agile. Thank you.
Hi, Stephen Oaken, first year SSP student. I'm taking a course called Strategy of Tech Dominance, and we've discussed cyber a bit. And one of the questions that the professor has posed is, when you look at cyber and the future of warfare, what does the fighter look like? Traditionally picture kind of like a beefy guy, and we're very good at training those people. But how do we, or how does the military integrate this new generation, or this new archetype of fighter? Typically, maybe looks like a guy in his basement in a hoodie, and not really keen on working within a military type structure. How do we, so in that sense, how do we identify these people? How do we get them to work for us? And how does the culture have to change in the military to get the best talent?
Yeah, so that's...
We got another couple hours, I guess.
I mean, particularly for the Army, I think we're definitely on the right path on this. So the first thing is, the Army's made up of branches, infantry, armor, field artillery. So the first new branch of the 21st century for the Army is cyber. And it's number 17. And the last branch that was created in the Army was in 1987, Special Forces. So the reason that's so important is when you have a branch, now you can manage your talent and related development. So the challenge we have is that before this branch, most of cyber existed in either the signal branch or in the military intelligence branch. And the reason cyber suffered was you get promoted and incentivized by being a signal officer or a military intelligence officer, not a cyber. And cyber's different, especially as I come in, I view it as an operational approach. I don't view it as signal or military intelligence. The second part here is there's other agencies in the government that have this problem as well, right? It's highly technical. And so how do you get technical talent? Well, I have about over half of the cyber force that we've been tasked to build for the Army in place now after 17 months. I'll have all of it in some form of build by this summer. I mean, it is we're growing in we're doubling every 3 to 4 months. But here's what we offer them. So first, we're going to allow you to do things you can't do anywhere else legally. Okay? That's second thing is we're going to train you to a national security agency standard. And the third one is you're going to be surrounded by people just like you, and you're going to be working on the latest technologies that we have. So that's a big incentive. So that gets them in. Now you got to keep them. So when I go down and talk to these operators, I ask them, so what will keep you in the military? Keep me on mission. You take me off mission, I'll be gone. I said, what do you mean by take out mission? Make me go to this school over here, or make me go to some normal unit where they won't take advantage of my talents. And so I think creating this branch has allowed this to happen. Even before the branch was created, we were having some trouble with this, but the Chief of Staff of the Army, you cannot move out of the Cyber Mission Force without my approval. Okay, so that stopped all that movement, right? And so now it's lined up. Now I just have to continue to progress on this. We've not only done this for the military, but now we're doing it for the civilians, because 30% of this force is civilian, which is also important, because you need to build deep expertise in certain areas. I think we're going to have a lot of work to do, though, as we go forward on this. This year's an interesting statistic. We made our numbers for the year in 15. We signed up 75% of them in the first quarter with no bonuses. That makes me happy, but in a way it also makes me sad. And when you do this, you have to sign up for 6 years as a soldier, so it's not my commitment. But I think they realize if I do this for 6 years, I'm going to be very marketable. And they're right. So, but that's a good problem to have, right? And if we can build this in the right kind of model, I don't think all of our operators should stay in the military. I actually have no trouble with them working in private industry or in other parts of the government, because I look at this from a United States view, not just an Army view. Now, I don't want it so bad that we're getting poached, or people are getting poached, but I think that there's a tremendous piece of this. This is actually one of my 4 priorities, right? Build a cyber mission force and other forces to support that for cyber. And so you're on a key part. For the personalities, there's 2 other pieces I want to add to what you said. This idea of a single person working in the basement is really fallacy. And what it really fully is a team sport. And the way I get people to see this, today, no one knows all hardware, no one knows all code. And so what happens is, wherever you go, you actually see teams. They have to be in a team. Even they may be distributed teams. A hacker, when they're working, they'll run up on a problem they don't know. What do? They do what we do. They research it, or they have a group, hey, anybody run into this problem? And generally they'll be, hey, yes, try this, right? And before you know it, that's how that goes. The other thing that's interesting is you have two groups. This is my perception. You have one that they do this in the daytime, and they do it at night too. They have labs in their basement, and they're just into this space, right? And then you have the other ones that are kind of into what I call extreme sports, all right? And what they're into is they are always challenging the edge. These are the ones that you can say, I don't think that can be done. Oh my gosh, that's like raising a red flag in front of the bull, right? And once you figure that, but managing them, that's a lot different than when I was an infantry division commander, brigade combat team commander. It's a different way to motivate them, different way to work with them. And I think this branch is going to help because it will be filled with officers, warrant officers, non-commissioned officers, soldiers, and civilians that will be like-minded against a very important one. That's a great question. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about this in Cyber Command.
John Richardson. I have a question about a fairly specific aspect of Army Cyber information operations. Thinking about DoD more widely, now that Fort Bragg has been reorganized and the JMISC has been shuttered for a few years, within First IO, what do you see the role of First IO within the information operations space, and where does the U.S. community look for leadership?
So this is a big debate. I've had several discussions with the Chief of Staff of the Army on this. So the command that he's talking about is under the operational control of Army Cyber Command right now. And Dave, we've had a couple discussions on this as well. So first, I go back to my Iraq days, and not to offend anybody, but you don't have to be there very long to realize that you're not going to get out of this problem kinetically, or if you put it more crudely, right? You're not going to kill your way out of this problem, right? So now you have to deal with populations, and I started that in 2003 when I started in Fallujah, Iraq. 2005 more, but we didn't really get our act together until the surge, right? There were just pockets. So first, I believe in this, we have to have the ability to inform and influence populations, and you have to get better at it than we are today. And I look at ISIS as one of the challenges, like why does this have global appeal? And what is our response to this? And I don't have the answer to that. I really don't. We're not aligned, my words, not aligned correctly yet, because information operations is in pockets, and there's not really strong advocate. The problem we have with cyber is converging. There's convergence. I wouldn't say it is convergent. There's convergence between information operations, electronic warfare, space, and cyber. So it's not like one eats the other. It's the way I describe it is like it's the battle between intel and ops. Who leads who? The answer is yes. Right? Depends. So it's the same thing here. It depends. So you can use cyber in support of information operations. You can do information operations in support of cyber. I think we need a transformation in the way we think about this. And this also has to happen inside State Department and in other agencies, because everybody approaches it a little bit differently. I think this bifurcated approach, when you're at the receiving end of this and you're talking to some sheikh or whatever, they're very confused on what the message from the United States really is. And so I really can't answer your question, but I think there's moves now to better align this inside the Army. One of the challenges we have, so special operations would love to get all this, but the reason that it doesn't go there, and I'm being pretty blunt, is sometimes when you put capabilities in special operations, you can't get it back out, right? So it's hard for it to support the conventional Army. That sounds parochial. I tend to be rather agnostic. I tend to stay very focused on the mission and I think when we get in these kind of turf battles, it's not helpful. And my experience working with interagencies and inside the government is we get people to see the mission and everybody comes together on it, and you tend to use a sort of fusion sort of approach, which is what started working in the war zones quite well. that may be kind of the approach, but we have to fix this inside first. I believe we need a complete transformation in what we're doing. And also, too much of this rides in special access programs and special technical operations. So a lot of commanders don't know the capabilities that we really have. You know, you have this kind of, it's a great capability if only I knew about it, right? And so these are some of the challenges. Hope that answers your question. I mean, I don't have a good answer to that. It definitely has my attention, and we're actually having a series of meetings here over who they're going to belong to over the next couple of weeks. But I think this is going to work out for the better, and we can really drive on this.
Thanks.
My name is Farrell. I'm a visiting undergrad from California. My question is, you were talking about the budgets of some of these companies like Microsoft and Cisco, and seeing how much larger their budgets are than the Army Cyber Command budget. It seems that it will only make sense for those entities to kind of work together. Do you see or predict some type of framework in the future for, maybe a company like Google, Apple, or Microsoft to work together with the Army, or maybe giving them some type of provisional security clearances so they can help?
Yes, that's a great question. So some of that exists now. Like for example, with Microsoft, we have what's called training with industry. So we sent three military personnel last year to Microsoft. One of them worked on setting up their digital crimes unit, right? And now they're all working for me. They weren't going to work for me. They were actually going to be distributed in the Army, but when I went up there and saw them, I asked what their next assignment was going to be. Now they're working for the Army side. And that's why I talk about the management people. I find these companies to be quite interested in working with us. They're more interested in what are our problems. Because sometimes the problems that we're facing are the forerunners of future problems, right? And so it's not all altruistic, but we can clearly work together. There's also a number of agreements inside the government where, a lot of them participate in things like InQtel, the high-end, I've had a number of these companies. I don't have a way to take a civilian out of Microsoft and bring it to my headquarters for a year. There's no mechanism for that in the government. I've actually asked for legislation to help me with this. I have two problems. One is you have to pass a clearance with a polygraph, okay? And so, a lot of people don't want to go through that. And for a while, there was this perception that if you were going to, when you have a top secret clearance with a polygraph, then you're working on things that could cause problems with civil liberties, right? So the easy way to not be in that trap is not to have a secret clearance, right? I couldn't possibly be working for the government because I don't have a clearance. So, which is, all of those I think are kind of fallacies. I think this is something that we have to really harness. And I think the way we're going to have to do it is with sort of a fusion approach. I don't think we're ever going to be able to get these kind of formal agreements. And I think what we need to say is these are our top 10 problems. Like one of the biggest problems we have in cyber is this, what we call situational awareness. How do we know what's really going on? I mean, if you start pouring down on this, you're going to be like, this doesn't look right. Where's this really coming from? Who is that? This kind of information sharing. So that's what I see is going to happen here over the future. The Snowden revelation, Mr. Snowden's revelations caused a huge amount of distrust between the tech companies and the government. And so I think that's starting to become overcome, but it's because the threats are becoming threats and vulnerabilities. You can't be your own island. We're all in this together. It's not like if you get hit over here, it's not going to be over here. I mean, I'm constantly looking at the Navy, Air Force, and Marines, seeing what problems they're having, because if they're having that problem, we're probably having this problem. We just don't know it. Hope that answers your question.
Let me just piggyback on that. I'm Tom McNaughton, I'm on the faculty here. And I wrote a book a long time ago about weapons acquisition, and this is sort of the classic challenge, like the one that the airplane posed back in 1914. You have a technology that's turning over at light speed, and an acquisition process that takes months or years to make a decision. For legitimate reasons, this is political money, it's got to be approved. And so you have to find a way to buffer the government away from this and yet still get the product and stay up with technology. Can you describe a little bit how you do that?
Yeah. The first thing is I hired one of the smartest people I know, Mr. Ron Pontius, right, who's been working at OSD for the last 7 years, and he is really helping. So some of the problems that we're having is with technology, you start talking about code. So think about an algorithm. Well, given that we normally buy tanks, ships, planes, when you start talking about buying an algorithm, there's a lot of discussion over what kind of money that is. I mean, this is, I can't tell you how much energy expended this, right? This is crazy. So the solution to that is maybe cyber acquisition is what we would call multi-year, no-color money. All right? So if you have, what that means is that Congress appropriates it, and then as I want to use it, I say, this is what I'm using it for. The lawyers determine what the thing, they say, oh, that has to be research development money because you wrote code and you consider that research and development, fine, call it research development. That's how we spend it. Right? These are the building blocks policy I think has to be put in place. The other thing is how do you turn it faster? And so there's been some work done recently. I'm not an expert on this. This is why I hired Ron. Information, he calls it information technology box, but you can describe a group of technologies. It's acknowledged as a requirement, and we can build capabilities, we can contract them from right away. So the acquisition went from years to days or weeks at most. Not everything fits in that. Not everything fits in that, but we're still getting that through the Army. Okay, that's the spirit. It's moving actually at light speed. We've been at this for about 8 weeks, and I actually think we might be able to get this in this year. And I'm rather an impatient person, but that people would just be stunned by how fast that moved for an acquisition policy inside the Army for cyber. The other thing that's come to the realization going to this is all of the program managers across the Army have started to realize that cyber touches them. Like anything that can pass a 1 and a 0 can be a weapon or be attacked. When you start to think about it like that, that means, I mean, anything you build today, go back to the car. Whoever thought that your car could get hacked? First off, why would you want to hack somebody's car? But, okay, somebody obviously was busy, and this started last year at Black Hat, by the way. Black Hat released a ton, you can type it in, top 10 hackable cars in America, right? But what was stunning this week, on Sunday, was when 60 Minutes actually showed it physically what could be done. So now I was actually, when I should drive down the road, how many young kids are like, I wonder if I can mess with this car over here, right? But my point is that is goes the whole innovation piece. But let me build on one more thing. There's some that say we should have SOCOM-like authorities, Special Operations Command authorities. So Special Operations Command has their own acquisition capability. We do not have that in Cyber Command. Admiral Rogers is dependent on the services to provide capabilities. The reason that I think some of this is being driven together is we're all trained at one standard. So whatever we create, I work very closely to make sure it's going to interface with the Air Force, with the Navy and the Marines. So everything kind of has to start joint or at least be interoperable. Because otherwise you could have this exquisite capability, but you won't have enough, you won't be able to scale it rapidly. This is another complicated area that is taking a fair amount of energy. I think we're still a little ways away from being able to harness it. I've argued that we need something like UTL for cyber, where you bring this is a program, you can Google it. It was created for the CIA, and it was created for them to have tough technological problems. They just put it out there, and anyone can bring their idea, and they have a whole system by which to do this. I think we need something like that. Because a lot of the tech companies, they find these to be interesting problems.
Just a thought, you might never buy anything in the sense of procurement money. You might just keep it in R&D, and it's R&D that sort of rolls through the tour of the tank, or because the minute you transfer to procurement, you slow everything down, and the technology is still moving too fast. So S&T and R&D money would be much quicker for this.
That's a great issue. I hadn't thought about that.
So General, you were talking earlier about how important it is to partner with the private sector and cooperate, but that means the American private sector. I guess I have two questions related to that. The first is, how does that impede your ability to partner with foreign allies? Because you're worried that whatever problems you share with them, they might pass on to their private sector who could be competing with the American private sector. And the second question would be, when it comes to the American private sector, we talk about the biggest companies, and they spend a huge amount of money. JP Morgan Chase spends, I think, $250 million per year on cybersecurity. It takes one small error for them to get hacked. But what about the smaller companies that could never spend that much money, but because they're in the supply chain, could be the entry? How do you partner with the smaller companies as well?
So, let me answer this a couple different ways. So, you saw that one of the principles for President Obama was to have more international sharing. The problem is all our policies aren't written that way. So it's easy if you're what you call one of the Five Eyes, right? You're our intelligence partners. That's a lot easier for us to work with. But even, one of the longest allies that we've had in the United States, with France, they're not a Five-Eye partner. It's actually very difficult for me to get the policy to be able to work with them, even when they're sitting now right next to us in Kuwait to help us along. So this is a big problem, and it is riddled with policy challenges. When I was at Verizon a couple of years ago, when I was on my initial foray in here, I said, what's the big problem you see in the future? They said, the ability to use foreign code, because some of the code being written in other countries around the world is actually quite good. But you as a military will say, oh, it's not American, and you're not going to use it, and so you got to figure out a way to deal with this. We don't have a good answer for that either. To be fair. The reason I go with I go to the bigger companies is the bigger companies. It's easier for a bigger company to work with the U.S. government, specifically the Department of Defense. I'm just being realistic here. Now, it doesn't mean I go to FireEye, I've been to Clinton Class, I've been to a lot of the littler ones. But they have normally very niche capabilities, and when you start trying to bring them in, we do not have a good way to bring them in because of what's called these FAR regulations, right, which is the way the government buys things. And basically, I had this from a previous assignment, a lot of people in Silicon Valley, they don't want to deal with the government. It's too hard, right? And so, at the time, there was a company there, what they did is they said, we'll be the interface to the government, you just deal with us. So it's like you're dealing with a private company, but that private company, it did all the back-end work. I think with the consolidation of the defense industries, this is, really working. But we absolutely need the little, just because you're little doesn't mean you don't have a powerful product, and we completely understand that. That's why I think a model like InQtel, a permanent R&D, S&T, type framework would be a lot easier for these little companies to be able to participate in the government, in my personal opinion. So, I think you hit on two of the big problems, right? International cooperation, which is a real challenge, and why? Because that's all built on intelligence and information sharing that was all done in the 1980s that we're still trying to apply to today's world, and I just don't think it makes a lot of sense.
Sir, good afternoon. Sebastian Crawford, Security Studies. I have a question. In the services, who determines who takes care of what? Meaning, the 1st Marine Division gets the Cyberattack, Mark for Cyber will take care of that. But on a strategic level, how is that divvied up?
So, don't let me cross the line. I always have a saying I always come off with, don't ask me about offensive cyberspace operations, don't ask me about, I have a security clearance, I want to keep it. Okay? I have a different approach and that I've used, and to me, it's best person against mission. Like, I'm agnostic with service, right? Because because I come out of the operational world, I tend to, when I look at a problem, I'm like, who is best at solving this problem? If it's my own service, great. If it's not, bring them in, right? So for example, in 2005, I was having a lot of troubles with snipers. On my compound happened to be 100 SEALs protecting the 5 top officials of the Iraqi government. I walked over there and said, I have these sniper problems, can you come help me? Absolutely, right? Now, I had snipers in my own organization, but they weren't trained like that. And this is where I'm kind of headed. So, to me, what I'm trying to create a construct is, depending on what it is, who's best equipped to deal with it. And then once it becomes bound, then we can push it down into the right service or the right organization that needs to solve it. That's my approach. Not everyone agrees with that. I mean, there's others that say, that's an Army problem, the Army absolutely has to solve it. To me, it's a problem, and we need best people on mission.
Joshua Trimley, I'm a student here, and I've worked as a technology manager for about a decade
In Silicon Valley.
in California. When you look at this, you talk about threats and attacks, and a lot of larger organizations will have statistics like we were under attack 44,000 times this year. I think that's a really loose definition of attack. So when you're talking about definitions and nomenclature, how do you see the Army driving in the future, being able to differentiate from something that's kind of a snooping or an intentional show of aggression, or even an autonomous mistake, versus something that is truly an intentional, destructive, non-intelligence related attack?
I 100% agree with you. I just read a statement where somebody says, we've had like 10 million attacks. I'm like, really? That means you really had 10 million scans. And you know that's what that was, right? That was caught by the... I'm like, okay. But I think what that does, it complicates cyber, right? It doesn't... So what's really an attack? What was a scan? This is what we call cyber situation awareness. This is one of the #1 problems, because it overstates it, because to people that don't know, you say you got 10 million attacks, they're like, oh my gosh, we're under complete assault. Actually, you just got scanned. If you had your network configured correctly, and you have the right hygiene and good user practices, you're okay. And so, I have a lot of education to do on this inside our own Army. The second part of your question, I'm trying to go back to. What's the second part again?
Just how do you think the nomenclature can change, and
Yeah, I think-
how do you drive that, especially at a policy level, to understand kind of the difference between looking over a border fence and rolling your tanks across?
So for the military, we normally do this through doctrine, right? We develop a common language. When we develop that common language, I can walk in any combined arms formation and look at the board, and I can tell exactly what's happening, just with 5 minutes. But cyber, we can't. I mean, that's the best thing I could find when I put it in the background that actually says, okay, stuff's happening. That's a little bit interactive. We're having some discussion now about how do we report the readiness of our networks. This might actually drive what you're talking about, right? Because what's more important, that you got scanned 10 million times or that one got through? Because 10 million is like, maybe it needs to be echeloned in a way that we can see it. Because the scanning also is important. Like if you get scanned many times, there's something going on. But we don't have a good answer to this yet. This is because we can't show it very well. I think this is one of the reasons it's still very complicated for senior leaders and average people to understand the problem. This is why I like Peter Singer's book, right? Because I think he tried to take a lot of this myth away. Say, look, here's really what they're talking about when this means here. And I think more people that write on this also will help in a way that the layman can understand.
Tom Dickinson, a security studies grad. What kind of things are happening at the service academies, in your case, West Point, to create an in-house cadre of cyber warriors?
Yeah, so, yes, this year we recruited, we're going to commission 15 cadets as cyber officers, 17, and we took 15 from Reserve Officer Training Program, ROTC as well. So with 30 lieutenants this year. The debate now is how we're going to train them, but I've already talked to the academy. If we do this right, we could actually do their training while they're in their undergrad, if we do this right. But I'm to go to, I think we have to, but I'm realizing the technology is moving so fast that we have to pay a lot more attention to these undergrad degrees so that they have a baseline that allows them to adapt to new technologies faster. What I'm starting to realize, certain people that have very narrow niches, let's say they got enamored by Python, which is a computer language, which is great, but what happens if Python goes away in the next 5 years? Then you're like of no use. But if you had a deep degree in computer science and you understood how all this was put together, we could adapt you faster. These are some of the things that we're trying to work our way through. The Naval Academy is doing the same thing. Air Force Academy is doing the same thing. But nobody else yet has a true cyber branch. I expect to see that as well, because we're all having troubles managing the officers and keeping the ones that we want in the service, because they don't have to stay with us. If they don't get what they want, they'll leave. And so part of this is our ability to adapt.
Thanks.
Sort of the second one, Donnie, we're on the RTC program. Sort of on a similar vein back towards talent management. This capability is something, as we know, we don't have a whole lot of STEM majors in the U.S. anymore. Is there any thought process to a non-ROTC scholarship to civilians who just want to get towards government service?
I'd have to check on that. I don't think we have that. I have Army scholarships, but I realize Army cyber scholarships, but I think they're only for in-service. In fact, I know they're only for in-service. But I'll have to, I think we have a few. I have to check, but I think we have some. Let me back up. So we're doing a lot of work right now with the G1 of the personnel officer of the Army. And there's an idea that maybe we need to do this like doctors, right? So certain degrees, like I'll use an example. I can count the number of people that have degrees on cloud technologies in the Army on one hand, right? Advanced degrees, right? So maybe we just pay all their school, right? And in turn, you give us this many years. So these are some of the initiatives that we're going to be able to do, because now we have a branch by which to do it. Before it'd be like, oh no, they're MI officer first, then they have to go to MI basic course, then they have to, and I don't have anything against those branches. I'm actually thinking that the cyber officers need a variation of the field artillery course to start, so they understand how they integrate into an operation, because where I come from, it's not cyber for the sake of cyber. It's cyber in conjunction with an operation that you're trying to accomplish. And we're going to use, cyber is going to be a big component of it. So, or a big component, but it's not an independent operation by itself. So I think you have, I'll take that. I mean, we're actually having a series of meetings here over the next couple of weeks again on, call it workforce management. This is moving at light speed. I mean, to tell you, when they initially briefed the Chief of Staff of the Army, how long it would take to create the branch, they said 5 years. He looked at me, 5 months later, new branch. I mean, that's like stunning speed for the Army. Now, when you go fast, sometimes there's a lot of pieces we're picking up policy-wise in place, but the good news is, I believe you cannot move fast enough right now. To me, the threats and the vulnerabilities, they're coming so much faster. We gotta just build as much capability as we can within what's already been programmed, and then ask ourselves, okay, how do we better partnership with private? Because if we can't do that, you're not going to solve this by growing the military. What we need is, everybody's going to have to bring their capabilities to bear against this problem.
So I've got a question. We've heard about, in the press recently, about a new organization kind of modeled on NCTC for cyber. Can you talk about that and your relationship?
Yeah, you know as much as I do, but if it works, I mean, I read up on it here, because somebody sent to me and said, hey, this looks like what they originally envisioned the Joint Operations Center at Cybercom to look like. But if this works like advertised, it has a real possibility. The danger is this. In the National Counterterrorism Center, it's all government, right? So the danger is, what I'm hoping is, we can't do this all in the government, right? We need to have the private side in there. And this has been our challenge, is how do you put that together? And I think the way that we're going to have to do it is with some sort of fusion center. And if they see value out of it, they'll come. This is what I've noticed. I mean, I'm really a, you've heard me talk about this, right? what was done to bring down the counterinsurgency in Baghdad was this thing called the Baghdad Fusion Cell, which was hardly ever written about, right? But it was a voluntary organization that created a network that actually worked very well against the network, and it was stunning results. The same thing here. I think if we put the right people in the room, put the right private, and we actually declassified our stuff and said, here's the problem, they'll take that back to their company, they'll do it. The only requirement is that you share back. What will happen is all the companies will show up, right? All the companies will show up. Somebody said J.P. Morgan. So I've been up there twice. I actually went there the first time well before I became Cybercom, or before I became Army Cyber Commander. This is important because it tells you how they think. I was there on the day of the London whale. You familiar with this? $5 billion loss. They viewed that as a success. But I was like, explain to me, how could this possibly be a success? Well, first off, the profit that quarter would be in the 18 billion range. But the real thing is what they're afraid of is a rogue trader breaking the company. That's what they're afraid of. So yes, we took a serious hit, but it wasn't, we got him before he brought down J.P. Morgan. And when you think about that, okay, sometimes you gotta put yourself, there's been a number of banks, right, that have gone down by rogue traders. And then I asked them, well, what are you doing? And they become much, much more intrusive on their, so for example, you go to a training course for information technology. I said, well, what happens if you break the policy? We fire you. That's how it works. We can't afford to have attack vectors inside J.P. Morgan Chase. And and the last time I went and talked to them, they completely reorganized the way they operated. First thing they did is they understood where all their data is. So cloud to me doesn't bother me. Cloud's not the problem. Clouds are used to manage data. The data in the clouds is the issue to me. Like, what data is in the cloud? How do you manage it? How do you protect it? Are you sure it's really protected? Do you really want your financial transaction data going around the world, or do you want to build a direct link between accounts and the actual piece so that it doesn't actually go outside of the cloud, it actually is on a secure line? That's an architecture issue. These are the type of things that the banking industry has really gotten on top of, because, think about it, they have a really big attack surface, as they describe it, because America likes to bank online, right? And when I don't know how many people have had their credit card replaced this year. 2 times for me, okay? So, it's not my wife, it was me. But anyways, so I think, the financial industry is a place to really look, because they're taking a lot of hits, right? But what they've done to improve the professionalization of the workforce, the understanding of the workforce, what they've done with their architectures, what they want from, when you talk to them, they're like, can you all do something about this? Like, we're on defense. Where's the offense? I mean, we just take it. Why don't you guys do something about that? And this is one of the frustrations of the private world, is why should we have to keep taking all this punishment like that?
Patrick May, I'm a recent graduate. When you find something like a zero-day exploit in a commercial product with a partner, you partner with Microsoft, you partner with Google. When you find an exploit, how do you decide whether to keep it and potentially use it later, or to reveal it and enhance security of the nation as a whole?
This is also, it is a big issue, and I think Dan Gray, you know what I'm talking about, Dan? I'm mispronouncing his last name. Yeah, he was the keynote speaker at Black Hat. I chat with him periodically on this. He came out and said that all 0 days should just be, the government should just work on 0 days and just release them, right? But the problem with the 0 days, anybody knows, vulnerabilities, and I'm going to kind of stop here. Vulnerabilities are also how you do things, right? And so there's an intel loss gain, and there's an operational loss gain. So if everything was completely hard, this wouldn't be an issue. The problem is I don't think you're ever going to be able to build something that's completely hard. When I was at Carnegie Mellon a couple weeks ago, they actually believe that it's going to be impossible to harden everything, and they're working on a different approach. They call them kernels, where you have little kernels of protected code that operate, and then we use virtualization, so when you recognize something's wrong, you just crush your system, bring up a new one. But the kernel's what really protects you. Then you can use all this dirty stuff. So I heard the same thing when I was out of Stanford, the idea of a phone, like your phone won't really be your phone. Your phone is actually two phones, a virtual phone and a real phone. And when the real phone recognizes your virtual phone's been compromised, it crushes it and creates a new one. I said, is somebody really working on that? I said, yes, it'll be worth billions of dollars. And so this kind of, yeah, I mean, if they get that, that'll be stunning, and that will do a lot. But there's a lot of technology behind that, and there's a lot of people working on this. So this idea of 0 days is not, it is a piece of it, right? But what I'd say is, when those Unix developers wrote, they never dreamed that someone would do that. A lot of vulnerability arises when you connect it up to the internet when it was never intended to be connected to the internet. That's where the vulnerability really arises from.
I don't know about that analogy, sir, on crushing kernels. The Army's good at that, I guess. The General's got a hard time, so 2 more questions. So 2 more questions?
Dave, you killed it.
I know. But your staff would kill me if I don't keep you on time. No, somebody's got a question out there. Because I know that certainly that there were some taskings in the General's talk today, because I think there's a lot of papers that can be written and published in the Georgetown Security Studies Review on these topics.
So if I could close with this, so I was in the Pentagon on 9/11, and I was working for the Chief of Staff of the Army. And if you go back to that time, the Army was under a lot of pressure by the Department of Defense to reduce its structure. And for the older in here, the idea was bringing the Army to 6 divisions. And so that we were spending enormous amounts of time on this. And General Shinseki was very, very gracious through all this. And I learned a lot through this very difficult time. But when 9/11 happened, the date changed. It was like, what do you all need? I mean, the idea of 6 divisions went out the window. And it's like, hey, we have to, what do you all need? And what I realized is, and I was a strategist, one of 2, supposed to be doing deep thinking. We never thought about that. We were spending all our time on the here and now, and so we weren't ready. And so my challenge to you is, as you look at things, remember there's another, like the military's going down. What I caution all the strategists is, something could happen, it could go up. The first time we think about that should not be when something happens. It's the same thing in this space, right? It's like, okay, things are getting better or worse, whatever way. You gotta account for the other side. And that's what I would offer you, is you work through the policy, work through paradoxes, work through strategies, that account for both sides. Because there's this, I'm a bit of a Clausewitzian, this friction and luck and chance, it all plays, okay? And sometimes it's like, did you just get lucky? I don't know, but I'll take it, okay? I don't care, right? Bottom line is it helped us do what we needed to do. And sometimes you can make your own luck with some great thinking out there in front. So I really enjoyed the questions today. I actually have a number of task force myself here to work on, and I appreciate your interest in cyberspace, cybersecurity, and what this is going to mean to the country. Thank you all very much.